All right, welcome everyone. We're just doing our final situating here to be ready for our final Communiversity session of the fall 2025 academic semester. You are here today with us at the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin Madison. The voice you're hearing right now is me, Mary Beth Collins. I'm the executive director of the center, and I am actually sitting here in our building at Nancy Nicholas Hall on the UW-Madison campus. But we will be joined today by virtual panelists who you'll mostly be hearing from today. I'll kind of help move along and facilitate this conversation. The topic that we're going to be discussing today is nonprofits and philanthropy working abroad in 2025, navigating recent developments in government policy and regulation. Very exciting topic, very excited to hear from some friends of our center today who have great perspective on this complex and dynamic topic and time. Next slide. I'll just share a little bit about our Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies while we try to unfreeze our slides here. We are a center at the University of Wisconsin Madison that does teaching, research, and outreach related to community efforts, the nonprofit sector, and civil society. If you're not already on our lists, feel free to reach out to us after today, and we should be giving you some ways to do that just at the end of our presentation today, a QR code and ways that you can get connected. I think that what I'm going to do while Michaela sorts out the slides here is just go ahead and allow each of our panelists to introduce themselves so that you listeners and those watching the recording know who we're hearing from today. So let's start with Mark Seidel. Just Mark, if you could share who you are, what organization you represent. We'll do very brief intros now before we get into your overview remarks in a moment, and then you can pass to Enzo and so on.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mary Beth, and everyone there for hosting this Communiversity session today. I'm Mark Seidel. I teach at the University of Wisconsin Madison, and I'm involved with philanthropy overseas, particularly in Asia, and cross-border philanthropy issues. So I'll be talking about some of those impacts today.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Enzo.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, I'm Enzo Bolletino. I am a senior research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and I lead a program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative on resilient communities. I do research in Southeast Asia, predominantly on disaster risk and resilience, and have also been involved in humanitarian leadership training for humanitarian professionals for just under a decade. Over to you, Gina.
Thank you. And so it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Eugenia Podesta. I'm Vice President of Leadership and Social Impact with Vital Voices Global Partnership. We're a nonprofit based in DC in the US that does work abroad, primarily supporting women leaders through a diversity of training programs and capacity building, some of which take place in the US, but prior to this year, a lot took place abroad. We also have some initiatives that support women in crisis. So that's support directly to those that are in situations of crisis that need financial and other aid, depending on the situations that they're in. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you all so much for taking a little time with us. We're sure to learn a lot from all of you and your unique perspectives, but also perspectives that have a bit of a bird's eye view on this topic. I want to just share with everybody that this is actually a follow-up session to one that we hosted in March of 2025. We discussed sort of the same overriding theme, but in a slightly different moment. This was just 2 months or less into the new presidential administration. And during the first 2 months of the current presidential administration, we had seen dramatic changes to foreign aid from the United States government, including the substantial ending, essentially, of the USAID agency. And this resulted in massive disruptions and winding down of efforts that had historically been supporting a lot of basic humanitarian and other needs in the world. During that time, we were sort of dealing with the initial shock waves of that. And some of the things that we heard in that session were about shuttering of programs, for example, health clinic programs and the like in the global south that had to shut their doors kind of immediately upon being told to stop work by the US government. Of course, there were other more administrative restructurings happening and bigger questions arising about what the future of global development would look like. One of the other things that we talked about was that the global development community had known for a long time that there was probably a need to push more of the discretion and empowered work from larger INGO and NGO settings down to the local communities and grassroots organizations. And that struggle and effort had been ongoing for some time. But sadly, the way that we were feeling in March was that the promise of those modifications to the way that we do the work was now going to be sort of irreparably and dramatically changed because of these changes with the US governmental approach to this work. And in a sort of, in another way, there would be sort of a forced transition towards grassroots and local control by a not so pleasant reality that a lot of the funds that had been flowing from more of a scaffolded approach would now be stopped. So we also at that time had polled some of our partners at the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies that are doing work out in the world and that had viewed these impacts in their communities. And there is more detail about that in a blog post that we published after that session, which is on our website, and we can put a link in the chat or put it with the YouTube video of this presentation if you want to look back on where we were in March. So now we've had several months that have passed since then. At that time, we were still also trying to understand what the actual legal changes were that were coming out of the administration. And Mark Seidel, one of our panelists today, had given us a really useful overview in that session. And so we're going to kind of follow up on that today by starting out with Mark giving us about 10 minutes on just sort of where do we stand today, perhaps from the legal or structural perspective on this. And then we'll turn it over to Enzo and Gina to provide their insights from a slightly perhaps more program-oriented perspective. Mark?
Thank you. Thanks, Mary Beth. Thanks to the center and to everyone who's listening today. We appreciate your time. Let me start with a few minutes, as Mary Beth indicates, on, in effect, sort of where we are since March, some of the federal regulatory and policy changes that impact foreign aid and global NGO work. We're not looking at a change in direction since March. We're looking for an acceleration and deepening of most of the federal actions, both executive branch and congressional, that we were discussing back in March as well. This began with the defunding of most of American foreign aid through the USAID, the Department of State, and other agencies, primarily USAID and the State Department. But the actions taken with respect to foundations, philanthropy, the US nonprofit sector since March have only expanded and deepened those impacts. So let me talk about some of those actions against the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector in the United States that impact foreign aid and global NGO work, but I should point out that they also impact domestic philanthropic and nonprofit work in the United States as well. So I'm going to go through a few of those regulatory threats or actual changes since the spring. We are seeing the targeting of foreign funding outside the United States. There was a discussion of an executive order coming from the White House in April and May that would actually target some aspects of foreign funding by private organizations. Foreign aid, of course, had been substantially reduced as a result of the changes to USAID and the State Department. And the next step, which was not taken in April and May, was an executive order which would have prevented private organizations like foundations from either working on certain kinds of topics, climate change, for example, or working in certain kinds of countries like China. That has not yet been issued, but the administration has tried to take other efforts to put pressure on those that provide funding for development assistance, sustainability, and other areas outside the United States. So we are seeing a variety of investigations, both by Congress and by Treasury, IRS, which seek to target especially organizations that provide funding outside the United States. Recently, for example, one of the committees in the Senate has issued investigation letters to the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, particularly with respect to their so foreign funding was one of the targets, but in addition, the administration and parts of Congress have taken other actions against the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. So, for example, there is targeting of tax exemption and other tax privileges that the foundation sector and the NGO sector has. And there's a variety of other targeting going on toward the philanthropic and nonprofit sector. In addition to this, we have the targeting of specific organizations, not just policy or regulatory targeting, but the targeting of specific organizations that work in the field. I've already mentioned the Gates Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Perhaps primary among these groups is the Soros Network, the Open Society Foundation, which, as many of the listeners may know, is a target of the administration both before the inauguration in January and after the inauguration in January. So we have regulatory shifts attempted or accomplished by the administration, but we also have the targeting of specific organizations. In terms of the impact on foreign aid and global NGO work, which the center set as one of the topics or the key topic for our conversation today, in effect, with US government aid being largely shut down as a result of the early moves by the administration, the more recent moves, both regulatory and with respect to particular institutions, have put enormous pressure on the foreign aid and global NGO system, not only to try to get more funds, which is deeply needed, but because those organizations, the funding organizations, the private organizations like Soros and the others, are under tremendous pressure at this point themselves, and the needs are so great, it has been so far impossible to make up the needs that USAID, the State Department, and other organizations were funding before. So the impact on the foreign aid and global NGO sectors has been very deep indeed. I know that the other two speakers may talk about specific examples, specific countries, specific lines of work, but what we are seeing since January and particularly since March is really a two-pronged regulatory and policy set of threats. One, which has been largely successful, has been shutting off the spigot of most official US government aid. We're familiar with that. And the other is a variety of threats and pressures against the private actors that act in this field. That is not yet completed. It's only partially successful so far. The foundations and the NGOs, as I think many people on the call know, are fighting back about this. But the administration has tried to put pressure on a range of these organizations to prevent them from carrying out their good work. And in some cases, such as Soros, hoping to close them down entirely. I'm going to stop there. That's about 9 or 10 minutes. Turn it back to Mary Beth and to the next speakers, and I'll be here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And I hope that you win the prize for today for multitasking in the middle of an unexpected disruption. Well done.
Yeah.
Yes, and I do want to just follow up with a couple of quick clarifications to really make sure that we're understanding what you just shared, if that's okay. So one is that USAID was basically all of its administrative functions dismantled in early executive order phases. There's still always the possibility that in a future stage of this United States journey, that Congress decides that funding some sort of involvement globally is a possibility. I think the infrastructure of that apparatus, though, has been probably irreparably harmed for the foreseeable future. But there are some legal challenges that I think might still be in play to some degree. Do you know if that's true? Is it of any material consequence, or is that just something to sort of watch that space for now?
Yeah, it's primarily watch the space in the sense that there are legal challenges, Global Health Council and others still alive, involving some of the cuts to USAID or other programs. And in some cases, because one of the sites of resistance has been at least the lower part of the federal judiciary, it has been possible to get temporary restraining orders and other ways of temporarily blocking some of the administration's actions with respect to foreign aid. But for the most part, the foreign aid spigot has been turned off. There's always a possibility that eventually some of this litigation will turn out positively for the foreign aid sector. But I think that we're seeing at this point, as you said, pretty much the end of USAID for the time being. Now, when a different administration comes back into power, we could see the executive and legislative branches trying to reconstitute some kind of rational foreign aid structure for the United States. But as everyone on the call knows, that's probably at least 3 years away.
Okay, and one final follow-up, I know that there's sort of two areas that I have seen with regard to this question of investigation of the philanthropic organizations or NGOs, nonprofits in the US that have been the most predominant versions of that. And I think one is sort of this idea of there's a domestic C3 of some sort that is doing work abroad, and there's sort of a terrorism angle that's sort of considered to be the justification for that, ostensibly. And then the other one is sort of, is this quasi-political or discriminatory or ideologically driven or other such domestic sort of angle or issue that's the justification? Would you agree that those are the two big buckets that you're seeing with the investigatory justification here? Or how would you describe the why of those investigations, even if only to indicate the what's being said about it by those that are proceeding with that?
Yeah, the investigations focus in a couple different areas. One, as you're saying, is the counterterrorism agenda. And there is an effort, especially in the past several months, to tie American foundations and NGOs more closely to terrorism issues. This has a long history in the United States, as probably most of the participants know, and it's something that the administration has been emphasizing, as I said, in the past couple months. But some of the investigations and other activities underway target things in different ways. Some are trying to target climate change and other fields of work that the administration does not want to see either public or private actors undertake. And other investigations, other processes are targeting certain countries, as I mentioned before, that again, either in the legislative branch or in the executive branch, the administration doesn't want to see worked with. That includes, of course, the usual range of sanctioned countries like Cuba, North Korea, etc., Iran, but it also includes, very importantly, places like China, where traditionally there have not been sanctions, there have not been prohibitions against US private aid, foundation aid, NGO activities, but now there's the possibility through these investigations that we're going to see more of a country-targeted approach. That's ongoing as we speak. So the targeting is in multiple directions, but it certainly includes the counterterrorism area that you're talking about.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for those clarifications or additional information. I realized that when I shared my plan with the presenters today, I actually had originally suggested that Gina go next and then Enzo, but I introduced you in the opposite order. Do you have a preference as to which order we take now? Okay, then just to stick with the way we did our intros, let's have Enzo go next and then Gina.
Sure, great. So, I think putting things into, let's look at the big picture, larger context here, even beyond the reduction in funding, but looking at the pressures on the international humanitarian system that come from increased humanitarian need, as well as being coupled with decreased funding and decreased resources to meet that need. Now, that clearly we're in that situation, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute about the global set of non-governmental organizations and community-based organizations that members of whom I've been able to work with through my leadership program over the past decade. And but before that, I also just want to add that while we have roughly 300 million people identified as being in need globally, in need of humanitarian assistance, and roughly $45 billion needed to meet that need, with only roughly 25% of that need currently being met. I also want to emphasize that the global scenario in which we're living and operating is not one in which it's conducive to tempering or lowering that humanitarian need. So you see a number of different things. Clearly, you saw in President Trump's address to the United Nations a real disregard for climate change. I think, in fact, he called it a hoax. Now, climate is clearly leading to an increased level of humanitarian need, both through disasters, but also over time through forced migration and diminishing of things like food security and increasing costs globally. So climate is a significant factor that just about everyone else is taking seriously, but it's driving up humanitarian needs, and an inability to focus effectively on addressing those things, both through mitigation and adaptation, is likely to lead, almost certainly will lead to increased need above where we see it now. The second factor is around conflict. We're not witnessing a diminishing level of international violent conflict globally. And what's more troubling is that it doesn't appear that international humanitarian law is being respected or adhered to in a way that would mitigate the impacts of conflict. And that's troubling as well, because that can lead us into a logic of everyone fighting for their own purposes and their own designs, and not as concerned about being held accountable or having to adhere to the standards of international humanitarian law. So those two things are big pressures that can really lead to future humanitarian need. We're also seeing another thing that we've really seen since the U.S. administration came into power is a defunding, not just of USAID, but of all kinds of data repositories and data around climate, around humanitarian needs, around famine, and that is really challenging and dangerous, because if you can't access previous data and you're not collecting data at present, it's even hard to know exactly what's happening and how to target interventions effectively. So that's another significant problem. So and all of this is happening within a global context in which there's a prioritization and an emphasis on national security and increasing defense budgets. And so no one is really coming in to effectively replace the incredible amount of funding that the United States previously provided, to the tune of roughly somewhere around 43% of the international humanitarian aid budget. Now, having said all of that, we've been in contact with alumni that are working for organizations globally, in Latin America, in East Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. And while they certainly recognize that and emphasize and state that their program implementation has been seriously impacted, that they have had to reduce operations and staffing, that their supply chain and procurement has been impacted. All of these things are certainly happening. However, on a so positive note, what they're doing is trying to look for ways that they can adapt, and in a way force at a much quicker pace than was previously true, the localization process. And that is to really develop local capacity and look for ways to replace US-based government funding, either with other government sovereign funding or private sector funding, or other philanthropic funds. But in the meantime, they've had to do several things to adapt. They've reduced their staff, they've reduced operations. I mentioned they're looking for alternative sources of funding. They're trying to reprioritize programming. And importantly, they're trying to coordinate. This is both international non-governmental organizations as well as national non-governmental organizations globally. They're really trying to improve the way that they coordinate, share information, and work together in light of the significant reductions in funding. So it's not entirely a bleak picture, but it is it's a true long-term structural challenge, and the humanitarian system that emerges is likely to look much different than it did in the past. Yeah, I think I'll stop with that, and then we can take up more in the conversations ahead.
Yes, and I'm just going to kind of reflect back a couple of things that you mentioned, Enzo, from our perspective here at the center. I think to put a finer point on some of the themes you just addressed, just even from our center perspective and the colleagues we have out there, I do think it's important for people to really absorb this reality that the percentage of the funding that was happening for global aid that had been coming from the United States, right or wrong, depending on how you look at that as a matter of a policy initiative, it was a very significant percentage, and a lot of the apparatus and the data sharing and the infrastructure and the logistics and the roles and the staffing that sort of created that web, you know, it has been like very, very rapidly disrupted and shifted and stopped. And so I do think that the infrastructural question and the expertise question and the information question, you know, even if there is this new emergent potential new version, there is a lot of both tangible and intangible kind of like assets. There are a lot of tangible and intangible assets that are just going to kind of be lost in even in the rebuilding, you know, that might have helped usher through a next phase a little bit more smoothly. So I think that is something we're hearing and seeing a lot. I also would agree with you, though, that I am seeing, for example, just today before I was coming in here today, I got a notification from an organization that I follow in Mexico that's like a Center for Mexican Philanthropy, and they're hosting entire conversations like this, but in a much broader national setting, exploring like what the next phase is going to look like. So compared to March, I would say that I'm seeing some of those sort of regional conversations starting to emerge in this last few months, where in place, I think people are realizing that they're going to have to start building whatever that next version looks like, and going beyond the initial operations of very localized efforts, actually having more network-based conversations as well. So that seems very interesting to watch and see. But I personally am feeling a lot of regret over the fact that like just the layoffs and people that know stuff about this, you know, are out of the game for a while in many cases. And so there's some loss there no matter what. And the sheer number of resources, dollars and cents, right? There's just no kind of getting over that. Gina, I know that you have a lot of experience seeing what this looks like out there and how it's affecting both domestic organizations that are doing global work, as in the case of where you work, Vital Voices, and also what you're seeing from your constituents that you work and collaborate with who are on the ground in some of these global sites. What would you like to share from your observations?
Yeah, I think first, love to tag on to some of what was said before, but also understanding that the impacts now have expanded way beyond, right, the US government funding, and we're seeing this as an ecosystem-wide issue. I think many organizations, right, for those that were lucky enough to survive the freezes and the pauses and the back and forths that were such a strain on resources, are dealing with just significant instability and uncertainty. I think there was obviously a significant focus at the first half of the year on the impact of US government funding, but then we've seen that extend beyond even, to impact corporate foundations and other philanthropic actors in a way that I don't think was quite anticipated to happen so quickly. So, you're seeing a number of different challenges. The pressures are significant. And so for those that actually have the option of renewing or receiving back some of that federal funding, the decision was, is that something that you want to do, understanding the potential risks and challenges? And what we saw was, for a number of organizations, there was just really a lot of resources spent on the back and forth of even interpreting what was happening, to then determining what a response was, and then at the same time ending back in limbo with a lack of clarity, right? So my organization works in the women's space, and so what we're seeing, and this is the numbers that were last shared with me, that we're anticipating approximately up to 40% of women's organizations will cease to exist by the end of 2025. And this is global, right? And this is, again, to the point around the targeting of specific issues. This is absolutely a sector where we've fallen in the space of ambiguity, right? Because we're not necessarily called out, but at the same time, what is defined as diversity, equity, and inclusion is so vague that it has been basically interpreted to apply to women's organizations. And obviously, depending on the issues that you focus on, many of us fall within that realm. And so, as you can imagine, that's quite alarming. And what we're seeing right now, and I would say this is pretty much the scenarios that most are facing, is you're having to deal with really thinking about, one, if and how you're going to survive, right, as an organization. And that will have implications around funding, as we know. And so there is a need to really think about diversifying funding, as Enzo mentioned, for those that were not solely supported by government funding. They had that to their advantage, but at the same time, it's really thinking about how you bolster that. And what does that mean in this current environment where the need is so much greater than the support that exists? And so you're seeing a push for many organizations to really think about leaner operations. How do you actually get the work done in an ultra competitive environment? You're seeing the priorities for areas of focus are shifting, right, as a result of humanitarian needs and the demands that exist on the global scale. But as we know, it's now very much pertinent to what's happening domestically, right? So even foundations that predominantly supported global work are now looking at what they do more in the US, given the needs. And so that becomes more of a priority. What we're seeing is that, the pressure is real, and you're having to constantly battle making plans, planning for scenarios, thinking about innovating, thinking about new opportunities, looking at how you run leaner operations, how you're managing your cash flow in a way where you're not in peril, which is really taxing. It's been really, really taxing. For all of our counterparts, us included, the amount of energy spent on monitoring all the details around not only day-to-day operations and spending, as well as potential opportunities for the future, is quite impactful. So we're seeing a need to really think about, what does fundraising look like? And a lot of the conversations that we've been a part of is, who are the actors that are going to fill in some of these gaps, right? And I don't think anyone yet has the answer to that, but we know that we're not going to recover everything that's been lost, but this is going to have to change. We're not going to go back to what it was. So what does that mean for humanitarian needs? What does that mean for how we do the work that we do? And that will mean that a lot of organizations, unfortunately, will absolutely cease to exist. So this is impacting at so many different levels, like even the organizations, again, that are seeing that they're going to be able to pursue into 2026. It's like, what are the right staff you need to be operating, for lack of a better word? We're looking at startup culture in a way, right? Leaner operations, but making sure you have the staff that's able to adapt quickly and pivot and be creative and innovative, because that's really what it's going to come down to in order to be able to continue the work and have the impact that we want to have. Oh, there's so much more I can say, but I'll stop here and lean into the conversation.
That's okay, Gina. I'm going to do what I did with the first two presenters and ask a couple of small reflection back questions. One is, well, I guess it's more of an acknowledgement. I just want to say how much I appreciate what you said about just the expenditure of energy and resources that's gone on within organizations that are surviving this, to be able to navigate a lot of uncertainty and pivoting and repivoting. That is just such an important factor that I still don't think we've really understood or captured in terms of thinking about our colleagues and the burnout levels and the ways that the work is getting harder. There's more of it as other organizations fall away and funds fall away. And yet those that are continuing the work are also having to navigate a lot of complexity, including talking to their boards about, do we want to continue to receive these funds if the funds come with new strings attached that we do not necessarily easily align with our mission, for example. I also wanted to kind of go back to something that you mentioned, and I think you're the first one that mentioned it, which is the way that we're really talking here about policy changes that impact NGOs. And I think we immediately go to like the executive orders that, you know, disrupted and dismantled USAID and some of these investigatory things and some of the other EOs that relate to DEI. But there is also this like zeitgeist shift or more ambient shift that is happening. And you suggested that that might even be affecting corporate funders. Can you just put a little bit more detail on that if you're willing? I'd love to hear how that ripple effect is occurring from your observation.
Absolutely. I think it's, similarly, it's understanding that those policies impact also corporate foundations working in this space, right? So if they're supporting climate change as an example, I mean, they're also then under the microscope, and that is inhibiting their ability to move forward in supporting some of those initiatives. I mean, for some, it's, more of a decision. For some, they feel like they don't have a choice and have to move forward in that way and shift the focus of their philanthropic support. So we've seen this firsthand, right? So we're a number of corporate donations that are moving away from, as an example, supporting women's initiatives because of that pressure, as an example. Some of the foundations that are under the microscope, it's the same thing. We're seeing that as well. And what's interesting, we were actually in Europe last week, and a lot of the conversations we were a part of was also hinting at this idea of and I can't remember if it was Enzo or if it was Mark who mentioned this, the erosion of standards, right? And so the fact that the US has moved away from the humanitarian standards is giving the green light to others that we would have historically thought would not bend on these issues. We're seeing that they are now. That is part of the conversation. And they're also seeing divestment, and they're seeing challenges as well that extend way beyond US funding sources.
Right. That's very helpful. Yeah, there are implications to this that aren't as direct as disruption of funding or an actual policy that impacts the user. It's also about the shift in dynamics and I guess the baseline of what's acceptable and what's not, and what's going to be targeted and what's not across corporate America. And also it sounds like you're seeing it in global maybe counterparts as well. So
I think the other thing that's important to note, obviously there are many different factors contributing to this, but a lot of corporate foundation, corporate social responsibility dollars are decreasing. And so, you know, a lot of that has been a result of economic performance and how they've been impacted by tariffs and other things, and where we are right now, right? But that's something else to note. So again, the funding that was historically, or at least previously available, is shrinking as well from that sector.
Right, because it just feels too touchy, right? It's kind
No,
of the
because
idea.
their bottom line has been
And
impacted.
their
So
bottom line
yes,
is also impact.
yeah,
Yeah,
and a lot of
okay.
them, it's a percentage of revenue that they
Okay.
allocate, right? So yeah,
Right. So this could also relate to other policy things we might all be thinking about as Americans, like where are we economically and how is economic policy affecting corporations' bottom lines, which does in turn impact some other available dollars that we might have otherwise looked to in this case. Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, so I have just two facilitator questions that I'm going to ask the panel in turn, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from anyone and everyone that's here today. And my two questions, we'll take them in turn, but one relates to the perspectives that we're seeing from our partners abroad, and one relates to the perspectives that we're seeing from Americans and electeds in the United States. And I'll give a little more detail, but just to know where we're going with this. So I was able to, after the resumption of a stopped grant, travel this summer to Timor-Leste to complete a project that was funded by the embassy in Dili. And I had a very profound experience of that project and my partners there being with me in the confusion and the disruption of having a stop work order on that project for a few months and then having it come back, and we were very delighted about that. But also through that understanding, this was the rare exception, that many of the projects that they were seeing in their area of the world were not coming back on. So they saw a huge decline of USAID funded project work in their area in this period when we were still working on this modest but impactful project together. And when I got there, I felt even more heightened sensitivity about the fact that I am representing the United States, and this is the context that I'm coming into, and just wasn't sure how people were going to be feeling about our relationship, essentially. And I was met with so much grace and understanding personally, interpersonally with my colleagues there. But it was also true that they were suffering. And I met with grassroots organizations who had entire project plans, you know, that were now just done and off midstream. And so I know it's a complicated thing to answer, but if anyone has any anecdotes or general themes that they've seen, the question really is, how are you seeing your partners abroad reacting about this when it comes to their relationships with your organizations, their understanding of the United States, just perspectives from abroad? Like, what impact is this having on the way that our partners abroad might be viewing us or considering us as future partners? Mark.
Just to say briefly that my work outside the US is primarily in China, India, and Vietnam. And what we're seeing there with respect to aid partners, grantee partners, program partners, is very similar to what you were describing for Timor-Leste. A tremendous reduction in revenues, as each of the other speakers has talked about. A tremendous reduction in the ability to carry out programs, the need to raise more funds, the need to try to do more with less. All of that's occurring in the countries that I work in. But also that state of grace that you were talking about, as I talk to NGOs that I know and have worked with over a period of years in places like China, India, or Vietnam, they don't blame the American people. They know where these policies are coming from, and they understand that the effects of these policies are very direct on public aid and are somewhat more indirect, but quite real on private aid mechanisms, whether it's private foundations, whether it's corporate foundations, as Gina was mentioning, or other kinds of funding. Now I'm going to, as Mary Beth knows, I'm going to Peru and Chile toward the end of the year, and I'll be asking some of these questions. And the initial response I get from colleagues in Peru and Chile is that the United States, at least on the public side, is an untrustworthy partner at this point. And they look now as to places like China to perhaps be more trustworthy partners. As someone who has watched and done research on China for a very long time, I have my own doubts about the trustworthiness of Chinese aid. But there is a sense out there that with the United States having sort of fallen out of this and being an unreliable partner, that the search is on, if possible, for more reliable partners. I'll stop there. Thanks, Mary Beth.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna do that reflect back thing for a moment, that I think the word unreliable is an important one to lift up here too, because it wasn't just that the aid reduced. It was the fact that people were midstream with contractual project, like promises and obligations that were suddenly pulled up from under them. And this government shutdown, I surmise from continuing connections that I have, has not helped with that, because State Department offices and places abroad, not paying their local in-country employees. It was very easy to see the way that you could look at things side by side, like Australian embassy versus US embassy, which one feels like a better place to work right now? Those very real things of like, will I get a paycheck? Will my contract be honored? I think it's very difficult to admit, but I think something that you would have thought was a point of pride for us is very damaged right now. Yes. Enzo and Gina, what are your thoughts on this one?
I mean, I can third, I guess, as the third person here, that the constituencies with which I've worked have remained, there's no kind of ill will or animosity. There was no expectation that the US had some kind of obligation to provide their countries with development and humanitarian aid funding. The way that they're dealing with it is to try to adapt by better coordination, better working together, looking for alternative sources of funds. However, what I would say is that the risky thing here is that, I mean, they have to meet humanitarian needs, right? They have to meet needs on the ground, and these organizations are going to do whatever is required with new potential donors to try to address those needs. And the U.S. Involvement in international aid historically is not, it's not simply out of a sense of obligation or duty to provide support. It was seen as a way of bolstering United States security through the projection of soft power, through basically sharing U.S. values globally through development and aid funding. And that's pretty much out the window now. And so now we are in a logic in which it is a multipolar competitive world that's based on security and less one rooted in values. And I would say that, it's not both the United Kingdom and Australia moved their independent aid organizations into their foreign service departments, but they did so in a way that was more responsible, that really evaluated the effectiveness of the programs, that looked for ways to make them more efficient. It wasn't an ideological move to simply slash and burn and close everything down, just irrespective of what merit any program had. And as you mentioned, a lot of people were relying on life-saving aid, and those services were simply cut. So it wasn't as if they were slowly drawn down, they were cut midstream without any real cost benefit of analysis of what that would mean, even for not just for those people for whom it is obviously dire, but in the long term for US interests and US well-being, that we're not going to see the repercussions of for some time, but it's clear that there will be some cost.
Gina, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I would say similarly, I think what we're seeing right now is organizations are just trying to figure out how they're going to survive. And so those that receive that funding that was rescinded either through a primary grantor or sub-grantee process, or they were receiving it directly. Um, Obviously, they were all very blindsided. So it took some time to process and really think about how you continue the work. And those are the conversations we're having now, right? There's a lot of focus, as Enzo mentioned, on collaboration and thinking about how you streamline resources, work closer together, be crystal clear around the work that needs to happen, and thinking about creative ways of supporting it. And what that is going to result in, it's still unclear. There's still a lot of conversations and discussions, but we anticipate there's going to be continuous change for quite some time.
Right, thank you. Now, I know Mark's going to have to drop off here in just a few minutes. So if you are in the audience and you have a burning question for Mark, please raise your hand ASAP. Otherwise, I'll go on to my second question and see how long he can linger for that one. Okay, well, Enzo set me up nicely for my next one, which is I want to turn now to the perspectives that we have domestically around these issues. And this relates to some of the work we do at the center around civic health, the notion that we all have the ability through many different levers and many different components of our ecosystem to have influence over our democracy, our communities, hopefully our electeds in that democracy, et cetera. And, when we saw these most disruptive changes happening in the beginning of 2025 to foreign aid, it was coming mostly through executive orders, right? So specifically from the president and the way that the president was working with agencies to change USAID funding, disrupt it. Some of the investigations are also coming from the executive branch, although Congress seems to be aligning with that, at least one side of the aisle in the current context. But we know that the programs that we're referring to have always had a bigger intention for the well-being of the United States. It's not just about helping others in the world because it's the right thing to do. Many would say, I support that too. I support providing some of our resources to address global hunger. But as Enzo pointed out, this is also about soft diplomacy, national security, mitigating the types of threats that make people become violent, providing a US role in other places that gives us better relationships and better trust and helps us in the past era promote democracy. And so I just wanted to ask, I think there were compelling arguments on both sides, frankly, during the executive order phase of this. I mean, wherever you stand on how you feel about the executive branch right now, there were, of course, examples of programs that hardly anyone could imagine that we would disrupt. And there were also examples that were brought out of programs that perhaps were not the most popular use of funding. And so these things are complicated, but I want to honor that people might have very different feelings about this. And there are examples that are good and bad of the way these dollars have been used, perhaps. But with regard to these questions of the role of US foreign aid and soft diplomacy as something that Americans could actually support in the future, do you think that people on the ground out here in the United States are continuing to think about this? Do they care about it? Are they willing to advocate for it? And how are elected officials likely to view this issue in the coming term? Obviously, one of the biggest threats to all of this is that we just have so many competing priorities right now, and people are having a hard time keeping up with all of the issues and the news cycle. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about the appetite of Americans, or the value that Americans might place on future programming and policy around US foreign aid and soft diplomacy, and where we could maybe see some opportunities in that landscape.
So again, very briefly, I'll be really interested in Gina and Enzo's views on this. But, sitting where we are, at least in the Midwest, in the US, It's hard to see a significant constituency, a significant, powerful constituency for foreign aid and for sustainability and development work outside the United States. Obviously, there's going to be small constituencies. There's going to be relatively elite constituencies. But I think there's a feeling that one of the reasons why, in addition to the ideological reasons, one of the reasons why the current administration targeted USAID was the perception that foreign aid work from the United States did not have a significant, powerful political constituency in the United States. To the degree that's true, that makes it harder to restart this work in a significant way. I don't have any doubt that under a different administration, we will see more emphasis on foreign aid and work abroad. But I wonder if we're ever going to get back to where we were in terms of the amounts of money and the kinds of broad range of support that was available to a wide range of countries around the world. And I think some of that goes back to the perception that foreign aid and work abroad is just not that popular in the American social and political system. I'll be interested in what Gina and Enzo think about that.
Yeah, I would agree 100%, right? I think there's just so many fractures as it relates to the role of USAID and foreign aid. And again, we know what is known for those that live in DC and in those circles, but the conversations that have been pretty loud and dominant over the last couple of years have been, to Mark's point, questioning that, right? Like, why is it that we're spending so much money abroad when we have so many problems here? So it'll be interesting to see how the constituency might change over the next few years. I think right now people have just been so focused on surviving the changes, but I think there's more to come, and it'll be interesting to see, even starting with 2026, what emerges and what are some of the conversations that will lead us in a different direction.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have very much to add to that. I do think over at least for several years now that publics within the sort of Western world have really called into question the effectiveness of aid and haven't been really willing to support and invest a lot in foreign aid. But what I do think is really important going forward, and the system is likely to look, international humanitarian aid system is likely to look very different in the future than it has in the past. But what's really important, I think, is to make transparent the value of aid and the costs of not providing aid in a way that's really compelling, so that people, when they're making choices about this, are making informed choices. It's not simply ideological. And so it could be ideological. People may want to provide support, and that's wonderful, but you also want that support to be really effective in meeting the needs of people that it's going to support over the longer term. And you want it to align, if you're a state, you want it to align with your basic national interests as well, which is, I think, the direction things will eventually move in, but I think it's going to be some time before that happens.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. Very important perspectives. I think we covered a good range of, the implications of some of the policy changes that we've seen recently. I'd love to open it up now to Q&A from anyone in the audience. And if you are joining us by Zoom, you can either unmute and come on audio to share your question, or you can place it in the chat.
There is one question in the chat now.
Okay, do you want to, let's see.
If you want.
That would be great. Izzy will read it out loud and then we'll have our panelists respond. Thanks, Izzy.
Yeah, it's from Liz Murphy. It says, I suspect that as these programs eventually, hopefully, get rebuilt in the coming years, it seems unlikely that they'll return with identical funding. How do you think we can prioritize the more limited funding as it returns, and how can the voices of the public influence those decisions?
Okay, are you all seeing that? So that in case you didn't hear that perfectly, feel free to jump in. Yeah, and I'll just mention while you're thinking about your answer that Enzo's remarks reminded me also of the way that even in the domestic nonprofit sector, some of the conversations that we're having are around the way that we really haven't told the story very well of the work that we do and the things that we sustain as a sector. And I think kind of bridging from Enzo's comments to this question, you know, we probably have some educational tasks ahead of us for the public to even weigh in these ways. But curious what you think about this question and how it might look, how people might help prioritize any resumption. Mark, go for it.
Yeah, it's obviously very hard to know now. We're at least 3 years away from a reprioritization of foreign aid funding in the US government. And we don't know what the political context would look like in 3 years or 7 years. But at some point, there will be some kind of a push to resume and to increase foreign aid leaving the United States. I'm tempted to think, and it's, you know, it's really dangerous to try to predict from this stage. We're only 1 year, less than 1 year into this administration. So it's really hard and dangerous to predict. But if I had to predict, I would predict that what emerges is something quite centrist in nature. That it's something that the center and the center right in the United States can agree on in terms of resuming and expanding foreign aid. And so ironically, the progressive critiques of American foreign aid and the fact that the progressive critiques might have been listened to in some previous administrations, at least to some degree, the political bargain that may be necessary to get foreign aid up and rolling from the United States again may be such that it's really center and center right actors that hold the sway in terms of what happens. Now, what that means in terms of foreign aid programming, I wouldn't hazard a guess at this point. But that's my initial reaction to the question, is that prioritizing, say, from a progressive point of view, whatever that means, may be very difficult when what's needed is just the agreement among political actors to restart things. But again, I'll be interested in the other panelists and Mary Beth, your views on this.
Enzo and Gina, do you want to jump in here? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, it's a difficult question, right? And I think part of it is we're gonna have to reimagine what things are gonna look like in the next few years, but it is an opportunity, right? And even understanding how priorities have been set historically and currently, I think it's an opportunity to revisit that as we delve into what this new system will be, is understanding how those priorities are set and who informs decision-making, right?
Enzo?
Yeah, I mean, I think organizations at the ground level, so national NGOs, community-based organizations, are already looking for ways to adapt, to better work with one another, to reprioritize some programs over others, and to look for alternative sources of funding. I think so greater efficiency and for a greater impact is always important, but that alone isn't going to meet the increasing humanitarian need globally, and so there is going to have to be some resources there. And then the question there is, to what degree do you have to balance for humanitarian principles and values with the funding that's coming in? Is it going to be from the private sector? You know, where is it going to be coming from, and what does this mean ultimately for the accepted core standards, core humanitarian principles and standards?
Yeah, for my part, kind of merging perhaps ideas from all three of those responses, I think it might sound a bit dire, but I think like a lot of blurring across national security, diplomacy with other global north partners, immigration, climate change, resources that are needed for developing technologies. I think these things are going to all merge into a stream where the most likely strategic reason that people will be able to justify humanitarian aid across the ideologies will be a perhaps more pragmatic one. Like if people are largely displaced or hungry, or willing to work with China more because of their humanitarian aid, and we're being left in the cold, which was entirely the idea of the soft diplomacy to begin with, right? In many ways, not that there aren't other values-based reasons for it. I think that that is likely to be where you see this rebounding, and it might be taking place in other units of government, like the military, or like, yeah, I don't know, other State Department initiatives, which is where this is now going to be housed. But it seems to me that if the world is suffering and there's more desperation, which I think some degree of that is a likely outcome of the retraction that we've seen, it's probably going to invoke some more visible security concerns for the United States. And I think much in the way that our, partners in Europe, and we tend to still be in some kinds of conversations about, things like trade, or immigration. These questions of what's happening in places that are really going to be suffering with hunger and climate change are likely to come into some of those diplomatic conversations as well. Because if somebody else is picking up the slack, that will enter into the discussions that we're having with Global North partners. Anyone else have questions for our panel? Oh, we've got some in the chat? Okay.
I can read it out again. This one's from Nicole. It says, "Hi, thanks for the presentations. I've seen some Department of State posts around humanitarian assistance for the recent hurricane, and curious on if you have insights on how this response differs from the prior U.S. aid responses in terms of who and how aid is delivered."
So let me start off by saying that Enzo and Gina are the ones to answer that really good question. As Mary Beth knows, I need to pick up a 5-year-old, so I am going to sign off at this point with thanks to Mary Beth and the center and Gina and Enzo for a terrific conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. And maybe we'll do a round 3 at some point in the future. So
Of course, pleasure.
thanks again.
So I can jump in. I think I don't know exactly what the role of the U.S. is. I know U.S.-based organizations, international NGOs, are responding to the hurricane in the Caribbean that affected Jamaica and other areas as well. I think the UK government may be responding as well. So you will see international non-governmental organizations providing aid services. I think even the private sector is working to provide to coordinate with international humanitarian actors to provide services. But normally in the past, especially in a situation like this, you would have seen, and often a lot of people don't realize this, but the U.S. military plays a huge role in disaster response when it comes to things like hurricanes or typhoons globally. It's been the U.S. military is deployed far more often to provide historically assistance and aid to disasters than it is to engage in war. Which is interesting, and it's not necessarily intuitive, but in many areas of the world, militaries are the first responders. That's less true in our area of the world. But you will there are certainly international humanitarian organizations, I think, backed by some sovereign governments like the UK that are providing assistance in response to this hurricane.
Any other questions?
Mary Beth, I have a question.
Yeah, Jamila.
Hopefully you can all hear me. My question kind of pertains to the dependency cycle that foreign aid can sometimes contribute onto countries. And I'm curious to know if you both have insights into how US-based NGOs or INGOs are working with places abroad to, in the wake of foreign aid changes, to make sure that this cycle doesn't continue, and how are they working on sustainability efforts to make sure that these places that are receiving necessarily like medical aid or education aid are able to still run without direct dollars funding their kind of work.
I'm happy to jump in on that. I think that's a really important question, and that's a legitimate question. And I think for well-meaning people, that's something that you should always be asking. You should always look at the impact. What is the intention of your program? Are you putting in metrics in order to be able to appropriately assess and evaluate the impact of that programming? And is it having the intended effect of people ultimately being able to manage things themselves, and whether that comes through building capacity, whether it's through education or some combination of factors. No, it doesn't make sense for anyone to create a situation where there's a dependency on outside aid. It's not a it's a kind of demeaning place to be for anyone who's a recipient of aid. And so people that are receiving aid typically don't want to be long-term recipients of aid. They want to make their own decisions, their own choices, and take care of themselves. Aid really is meant to be a something that is provided for an unforeseen major event where there are no other choices and resources. So it is important at the end of the day to look for ways that you can assess the impact of your programming and only provide programming where it's clear that you're having that positive impact. Unfortunately, now this is kind of a shock therapy where you simply throw everything out instead of looking at what was working and what wasn't, which is a legitimate question, right? If there were programs that shouldn't have been funded because they didn't meet their intended consequences, they weren't having real effect, and they were truly counterproductive or wasteful, then they should be cut. But that certainly doesn't characterize all aid assistance, and there are lots of programs out there that have truly meaningful impact on people's lives, whether it's through immunizations or other health services or a whole variety of other interventions. And you want to balance that aid with the goal of having people be completely self-sufficient and not wanting aid, which in large part, I think it's safe to say most people want that as an outcome. No one wants to be in a position of having to depend on someone else for their own livelihoods.
And just to add, so I operate in a space where aid was used primarily to facilitate building capacity of local leaders. So all of the funding and all of the programming that we interacted with was meant and designed for that purpose, right? It's really understanding what work is being done on the ground, who are the leaders, what is their vision, how to best support them, and that actually looks into a number of different aspects, including sustainability of those efforts. So very much a part of foreign aid, believe it or not, has also been to build capacity of others in addition to providing direct support and services. I envision
Yeah,
that
and
this
this
will
really-
continue, right? I mean, we're continuing that work, whether it's funded by federal government or others, and there are many organizations that are continuing to do that as well.
Yeah, and this relates a lot. This question is a great question and relates a lot to some of those introductory comments I made about how even when we had the fully robust last version, active USAID and that global development landscape and US foreign aid landscape, there had been for a long time conversations about the need to shift from the power center and the resource center being in like larger NGO structures with, yes, collaborators on the ground, but that there needed to be more and more of a pushing down to the grassroots level of the power and the resources.
Absolutely.
And that was a very incomplete project when this disruption occurred. So there's been a long awareness of this. Meanwhile, while that incomplete project, was sort of being discussed, my observation from being in some global, third sector and nonprofit sector spaces is that many, many innovators in the global South, and I saw this particularly in Africa, were long since in conversations about how to incubate, revenue models and things that would take them completely away from this like imbalanced power structure of having to apply to powerful large funders, show them all the right data, get that funding once again. Many innovators out there in the world have been working really hard on breaking that cycle and finding opportunities. But I think the inherent challenge in that is that in a lot of those economies and economic contexts, there isn't a lot to go around in terms of like selling things and fee for service. And there's not a lot to go around either with philanthropic notions that we might use in the United States, for example, to raise money for our domestic efforts. So that's some of the work that our center has also been trying to do is like, what of our models up here in the sector can we help translate for leaders in other sectors, or in other contexts. Some of that does translate pretty well, but the fact that you're talking about places where the economic challenges are already very dramatic also makes that just very difficult.
Absolutely. And so when you
yeah.
think about what is needed to support the leader, it's really figuring out the answer to that question, right? It's not necessarily just imparting,
Yeah, no.
diversify your revenue. It is about
Right.
thinking about
Yeah.
what are the missing pieces. And so as we think and re-envision what this work looks like, it's really thinking about that, right? What are the resources that need to come together? So we're not replicating some of those historic mistakes, but things have to shift and we need to make certain resources available, to your point, right? It's not like the machinery is not going to appear out of the sky. That's one practical example that we've worked with many times. So they're doing whatever they're doing, they're having an impact, but they've hit a standstill where unless money comes through to purchase machinery that will allow them to make lives better for the entire community, right?
Yeah.
Nothing is going to move. And so for each context, it's really about understanding what is the particular challenge and what are the particular needs and opportunities to figure out what our role is in enabling that, which takes more work, right? And not everyone wants to do that.
But I think you planted a nice seed there, Gina, too, with the idea that I think I do see examples where a small seed something coming from a philanthropic source or a global north source to a global south organization could be a meaningful incubator for something that is a more sustainable income generator or could contribute to a more sustainable economic opportunity in that community. So I think that that's an area where I think there could be possibilities to just help breathe some life into the next phase, which is going to be a lot more locally sourced efforts, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that and collaborations, right? Sometimes it's not the seeding, there are collaborative opportunities
Yeah.
that will allow for those outcomes.
Yeah. Any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, Enzo and Gina, before we kind of close out here today?
I'll just say thank you so much for reaching out to us. I'm really pleased to have been able to participate in the conversation. And on a positive note, I do think that local communities, local organizations are going to find and adapt to the situation and find ways of working that will at least alleviate some of the impact of the cutbacks in funding. And people are innovative. We will find a way to move through this.
Yeah, echoing some of those points. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. As you know, Mary Beth, it's like you're constantly doing the work. You don't have the time to take a step back and think through some of these things. But for us, it's always leaning in to the women leaders. I just came back. We had a convening last week. We had 50 women from 39 countries and what they're doing and how they're, the resolve that Enzo mentioned. They're just figuring out just amazing solutions and really that impetus to work closer together. I think that is also something that we're seeing. The sector is becoming closer. I mean, we have to have more of these conversations. We have to think about how we collaborate on solutions. It's not going to fall out of the sky and it's going to take a lot of effort. But how do we put some intention into reimagining different solutions as well to address the things that we know didn't work, right? And this is our opportunity to do that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I think the fact that this is happening in 2025 when global travel and virtual connectivity are possible, and these issues that we see in very disparate geographic areas still having similar flavors and values and challenges and opportunities behind them creates a lot of opportunity for solidarity. So I look forward to having experts like you all and our participants today who probably also are here because they're very interested in this topic. I hope we can keep getting back together and having these conversations. And also we are, as a center, hosting quarterly global meetups, which I want to mention specifically because those are really intended for folks that are out there doing the work in communities that want to have that sense of solidarity and peer exchange and collaboration. There's really no barrier to entry other than time zones and coordinating those and getting on a Zoom link. So if you want more information about those quarterly meetups with organizations doing this work on the ground and experts like this that we'll be bringing in and things, let us know, or just follow us generally and you'll probably get updates about it. Do you mind just maybe sharing those last slides then? This is our last Communiversity session of the semester, but we will resume in February for our spring semester, and we'll try to get for that semester a full slate of our lineup out in advance of when those resume. So I think we might not be able to see it, but yeah, this is our just thanks slide and a little reminder of where you can find us on the socials. Please do follow us. And if you'd be willing to provide your thoughts on today's session or your ideas for future sessions, please just go ahead and grab that QR code, and through the link, you'll get a small questionnaire. So Enzo and Gina, thank you again so much for your expertise and time today. I would also encourage people to check out where they are on the socials and on their websites. They're doing great work in their organizations. And one of these days, we're going to have to do one of these in person, y'all. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but we'll have to get together in person and break bread and do the thing off the screen. Thank you all so much. Wishing everyone a warm and cozy November, December, and we'll see you back here in 2026. Thanks so much.